Good morning, everybody. How's it going? Got about 4 minutes, and then we'll get our class time ready to go. Hope you've had a good week so far. So just get comfortable and be with you guys in just a few minutes. Good morning, guys. Good morning, Kitten and Jason. Katan, not sure the pronunciation, but anyways, good morning, guys. Hey, Leo. Good to see everybody here. Nice. Naaman, Kobe, Mia, Jesus, Celine, Gloria. Nice. Good to see you guys. Yeah, Kate Ton. I thought that was it. Janice, good to see you. Good morning, everybody. Hey, Brittany. Kenya. Hey, Jerry, good to see you. Hey, Kenny. What's up? Hi, Jocelyn. Good to see you there. How's it going, Shelly? Good to see you, Kevin. A couple more minutes. Just hang in there. Morning, Alexis. Allison, Maybelline, good to see everyone. I wonder, is this your guys' first class? Or did you even have another one before this, like 8:30? Hey, Sebastian, Sophia. Nice, good to see everybody around. I have one meeting before this at 8:30, so this is my second lecture of the day, actually. A different topic, critical thinking for me, Thursday mornings at 8:30, Tuesday, Thursdays. Yeah, so that's interesting. Yeah, if it's your first class, sometimes it feels like it's hard to get ready, but by the time it's number 2, you're already kind of in the groove. So, yeah. 7 a.m. class, that's real early, Kenny. Jeez. I sometimes struggle in the mornings. I've gotten better over the years, but yeah. Hey, Peachy. Say hello. Good Peach. Good morning, everybody. Okay, so it's pretty much now 10 a.m. Why don't we do this just to kind of make sure that we're sticking to the same pattern. Let's, if you haven't said hello yet or just kind of good morning or anything, just tap into the chat real fast, and that's my informal attendance record that I'm keeping. So if I ever need to go back and refer to it later, I can use it as a record. And if you have a different screen name from your username, then just mention it in the comment, and I'll take note of that. So great, guys. Thanks again for being here. Yes, Peachy says hello. She'll probably pop in and out. But yeah, welcome back. So today what we're doing is we're just going to kind of continue to work through some more notes and lecture material on philosophy of religion. We've covered the ontological argument and some important objections to it so far. And what I'll start off with is just a review of those topics one last time, and then we'll start to learn about some new arguments for the existence of God today. So that's the plan. We're still working through philosophy of religion, but we're going to kind of switch gears from the ontological argument to some other very powerful and classic arguments that try to make the same case, but in a different way, that God exists. Okay, so just to get back to the foundations of our first few meetings, we started off by just talking about the ontological argument from St. Anselm. So I'm just going to kind of review a lot of this stuff for you now instead of creating the detailed notes, since we've already had those from before, but just to kind of get our heads back in the game about this topic. So St. Anselm lived about 1,000 years ago, from 1033 to 1109, and in 1077 he wrote a book called the Proslogion. The Proslogion has this argument in it, which is called the ontological argument. And so, as you guys perhaps now know, it starts off with the author saying, what's the definition of God? He believes that that's something that can be clearly said. It's the greatest conceivable being, the being than which none greater can be conceived. And he says it really doesn't matter whether you're a theist, atheist, or anything else. When it comes to the word God, we can all agree on one thing, which is that it's a being thought to be the greatest of all, the greatest thing possible to imagine, to conceive, to think of in the mind. So God's definition is greatest conceivable being. And he points out that that's a common understanding between people who believe in him or don't. Afterwards, he says, some things only exist in the mind. And we ran through different examples of those kind of things, like leprechauns and fairies and like Spider-Man or, unicorns, whatever. Things that don't really exist, that are make-believe things. But then there are some things that, of course, do exist in the mind and in reality. Like, I don't know, take my cat here, Peachy. She's real, and I also think of her all the time. So she's in my mind, but she's also a real thing. She's not just in my head. Now, question, which of those two possible things is God? Only in the mind, or in the mind and in reality? And he says that it's got to be both. And it's because of the definition, greatest conceivable being. Because his point is that it's greater to exist in both. And since it's greater to exist in the mind, and then also in reality too, on top of that, than just the mind by itself, if the being's definition is greatest conceivable, then he wouldn't be greatest if he didn't have existence in the mind and in reality, which would be like saying the greatest conceivable being is not as great as you could possibly imagine, and that would be a contradiction. So he therefore says God, given the definition greatest conceivable being, must exist in the mind and in reality. Okay, and then beyond that, he adds this point, that God, who remembers this? Let me see if anyone could say it, that God cannot be what? So God exists in the mind and reality, point one. Point two, God cannot even be what? I want to make sure this one didn't get lost on you, because this is something that I find is a little less clear in some people's mind than the first point of the author's argument. He says that given the definition of greatest conceivable being, it also follows that God can't be what? Do you know what I'm trying to indicate here? Yes, good, Kobe. That God cannot be thought not to exist. But be careful, the way that you put it there. No, this is good. Yeah, it's all right. So God cannot be thought not to exist. That's not possible, he says. Because why? Because a being that can be thought to not exist is less perfect and ideal than something that can't be thought not to exist. So, I mean, it says in the... it's kind of like thinking everything else aside from God alone can be thought of as not existing, even the whole universe, the whole world. God can't be thought of as non-existent because he's too great for that. So in the end, he says, to the atheists of the world who say, I don't believe there's God, he's denying that they even have that thought, because he says that thought is inconsistent with the perfect goodness of God and the perfect greatness of God. So as he would argue, the real thought that is in the head or mind or speech of a non-believer is about something other than God, because it's not possible to think of God as non-existent. So he says technically those aren't God thoughts. Those are thoughts that appear to be about God because they use the same word, but they're thinking just of something different from him. Okay, that was the argument of Anselm, just one last review. And then we had to look at 3 different objections, and I'm just going to quickly speak on those again too, before we close the book on that and then continue on to some new arguments. So Gaunilo was a monk who lived in a similar time period as Anselm. Not much more is known about his life, but he was a monk, so he was a Christian and a believer in God, but he found fault with Anselm's argument at least. And here's what he said. He wrote a paper called In Behalf of the Fool. After he states Anselm's argument and analyzes what it is, he then goes on to try and critique it by giving an example. Now, you might remember it's the example of the lost island. The lost island, he says, let's just make believe that this island is an idea of the greatest conceivable island. Okay, so there it is. It's in your mind. You're thinking of a perfect island, better than anything else that could ever be an island. Now, what he's saying is that if you really follow Anselm and believe him, then you would conclude that this island must really exist, not just in your mind, but in reality too, since it's, again, greater to exist in mind and in reality than to only be in the mind. But we know there is no such great lost island, and therefore he says we should really be skeptical and doubtful of any attempt to prove that something exists in reality, just starting off from the idea of it as a perfect being. So the perfect island doesn't exist, even though we have the idea of it. And therefore, why should we assume that you can prove the being of God exists just by thinking of the idea of the greatest conceivable thing? Okay, so it's kind of like an argument by analogy. He's saying Anselm's logic doesn't work, but suppose that it did. In case it did, we could use it and repurpose it to try and make a proof of things that are obviously ridiculous, like the greatest island or whatever. So his Anselm logic doesn't serve. And then after that, there was the argument by G.E. Moore. G.E. Moore said existence is not a predicate. Who knows what's a predicate again? Let's ask that question real fast. Predicates are, in other words, what things? This is a word used in grammar, sometimes in logic. Predicates are just like, who knows? Yeah, it's an attribute or a feature of something, correct. Alessandra, yes. And others, thank you guys. So it's an attribute or a feature of a thing. It's a quality of something, something that you would say of something to describe it. If I say to you that, Peachy, my cat, has stripes or spots, those would be attributes of her. If I say that, I have a PhD, that's an attribute, that's a feature of me. So when we describe stuff in any sentence, we associate a predicate with the subject. Saying that the room is dark is talking about the room as a subject, and darkness is a feature that it has at that time. Okay, so what he's saying in his paper, G.E. Moore, is that the concept of existence is not a predicate. It's not an attribute. It's not something that describes or provides a feature of anything. And certainly, that makes some common sense. I mean, no one would ever describe something as existing. If I was going to tell you about my cat, Peachy, she's 10 months old. She's so docile and friendly. She exists. She's got stripes. See, existing is just something that you wouldn't refer to as a descriptor of a thing. But as much as that makes common sense, he wants us to think about it in a little more of a technical way. So he provides this analysis. He says, okay, compare two groupings of sentences. One of them are going to be sentences that contain the word growl, and that is a predicate. Let's suppose we're talking about tigers, and we use these various sentences. All tigers growl, most tigers growl, some tigers growl, and some tigers don't growl. Well, the thing he mentions is that those sentences all make fair sense. None of them are confusing or hard to understand. There are different sentences about how many tigers growl or don't, but none of them confuse us. When we then replace growl with exist, the new sentences that are generated by the substitution do not make clear sense. For example, most tigers growl can be clearly understood as saying that majority growl, minority don't. Most tigers exist can't be understood in any kind of way, because are we saying that most tigers majority exist and minority don't? Non-existent things can't be like in the minority because they don't even have a number to be counted in the first place. So we don't have any kind of clear meaning that we can assign to sentences that use existence in replacement of a predicate. And that's where he thinks your intuition will show you that it doesn't function logically the way a predicate does, and so it's wrong-headed and misguided for Anselm to argue that if you're a perfect being, you have to have this feature. Being described as a feature is just not the right way to think of existence. So says Mr. Moore. Now, after that, there was William Rowe, and this is my last review of the previous lecture, so just kind of capping that off. William Rowe wrote the article, Why the Ontological Argument Fails. And what he's saying in his paper is, you can't prove something exists just by defining it as existing. That's what he thinks is the flaw of Anselm's argument, that Anselm has simply defined God as a perfect being that exists, and then says, given that definition, you really can't deny that he exists because the definition says that he does. Well, William Rowe says that's not a good way to prove that anything exists. So he gives us this example where he makes up a word called magican. And magican was given the definition existing magician. He contrasted that with another invented word, magico, which was said to mean non-existing magician. So think of magican as people like Chris Angel, David Blaine, Houdini, real people that do magic tricks. Think of magico as like Harry Potter, Merlin, Gandalf, Dumbledore, maybe Doctor Strange, people that are just fictional, make-believe characters that aren't real, but they do magic in their stories. Okay, so what he said is this: if in reality there were no magicians, if there were no Houdini, David Blaine, etc., then we could still have coined the phrase magican. And if we did, it wouldn't change the fact that there are no such things as magicians. It would just mean that we have a word now which means existing magician by definition. And so making the word exist appear in the definition of something doesn't control whether or not it's real or not real. Now, his example is, I find, a little bit awkward because it's using the case of magican, and he asks you to then engage in like counterfactual reasoning, thinking about a contrary to fact scenario in which there were no magicians, but yet we still made up the word magican. That's not too hard, I think, for a trained philosopher, but maybe for some of us, it's a little confusing thinking about the different possible world where the magicians don't exist, but nonetheless we make this word. So I offered you a slightly alternative example based on his, which gives the same point. And that is, suppose that instead of magican, the word I referred to is unican. And suppose that I make this word and I say that it means existing unicorn. Okay, well, despite the fact that I've defined it as such, there's no unicorns anyway. So the word God or magican or unican could all be defined as existing things, but this is not a proof of the thing existing. Whether it exists or not has to do with the facts of reality, not with the stipulated definition. And so we can see clearly by the case of at least unican that me making the phrase up and defining those things as existing is powerless to really alter the facts of reality, which is that there's no such thing. Okay, so takeaway point: define something as existing, but that doesn't prove it's real. It very well might not exist, even if the word implies existence in the definition. Okay, so that would be my taking a look back at some of the previous meetings and all the information about the ontological argument. Now we're going to switch gears, and we're staying on topic with philosophy of religion, but we're going to start looking at new and different arguments for God's existence. And in my own opinion, if I was a person that was really trying to look for the best argument to convince someone that God exists, I would be more of a fan of the one that we're going to talk about just now, the cosmological argument. It's just my opinion, I guess, but I believe that it's the best, most high-quality argument that exists for the belief in God, for the existence of God. Some people who hear the ontological argument, of course, we've talked about all the criticisms, and I think some people come away with the feeling like, is this just sort of wordplay? Is he just messing with definitions, trying to use ideas to prove that something exists? I think the cosmological argument gets around some of those problems. It's got a little bit more persuasive power to me because it's just based on the idea of cause and effect, which is something that everybody, I think, can relate to, whether you're given towards religious thinking or not. So let's jump in and see what's this next argument for God's existence. We're trying to learn a bunch of them. So here it is, the cosmological argument. Cosmological argument. Okay, so now, first of all, this argument is ancient. It goes back thousands of years, and it's been written about in all kinds of different world religious traditions. In the West, we have ancient Greek philosophers talking about it hundreds of years before the Common Era. You can see it talked about in religious traditions, and just internationally, it seems to be a common thread that spans throughout a lot of the different world religious traditions. So it's ancient. It's not new, but an American philosopher of the 20th century discusses it in our book. And, so philosophers throughout the ages comment on and discuss arguments and ideas that trace back very far. So I'm just mentioning that in our book, it comes from this man named Richard Taylor, who's an American philosopher of the 20th century. But he's not the original creator of the argument. He just discusses and analyzes it in our modern time, mostly in our modern time. He lived from 1919 until 2003. And he wrote this discussion in our textbook back in 1963, Cosmological Argument. So this is the author that we're reading on this argument. This was his lifespan, and this is when he had published the discussion that we're about to look at. So we're going to, take it slow and get into all the details of this interesting argument for God's existence. Let me ask you a question to get us going here. The word cosmological, it's called the cosmological argument. So I think we should all be kind of clear about what does this word cosmological refer to. One of the ways to think about its meaning is that cosmological derives from the word cosmos. Sorry, so let me get my notes open for this. Yeah, so it derives from the word cosmos, and therefore I want to ask this question. What is the cosmos? Does anybody have this idea about that word? Is it in your vocabulary? What's the cosmos? What do you think of when you think of the word cosmos? That'll be our kind of jumping off point from there. So let me see your reaction. Okay, some are saying space. That's good, yes. But I also like the other additional comments, the universe. And let me just kind of bring those two things together. Often when I ask this question in any class, an initial response will be something like space, because you think of cosmos, you think of all the stars and planets out there. But think about this. Are we part of the cosmos? Yes. I mean, we're one of the planets in space that's floating throughout the universe. So the cosmos really, in the big picture, it just refers to the whole universe. It's not the unknown. I mean, there is unknown stuff out there, but we know the universe exists. It's not just the unknown parts of it. I mean, our Earth is known, and we're part of the cosmos too. Okay, so the cosmos is just the whole entire universe. It's everything. It's the whole thing. It's not just a part of it. It's not just the Earth or the Milky Way galaxy or the solar system, or it's the everything. It's all of space and time. So that's the whole universe. The whole entire universe. Okay. So the cosmological argument then is about this question. How could the universe ever exist? What's the cause, the reason that our whole physical universe exists? So it's an argument which is trying to investigate this question. Where did the universe come from? Why is it here? Why does everything exist? Why is there something instead of nothing? Why is there a universe instead of literally just having no anything? And so as the argument reaches its conclusion, it says the only possible explanation for the whole universe's existence is if it was created by a necessary being like God. But we'll get to the conclusion. I'm just sort of previewing for you the themes of the argument in general. It's about the question of the origins of the universe and how it came to exist. And ultimately, it'll try and get to the conclusion that God had to be the cause of the universe. Okay, so just some stage setting. But now we're going to go ahead and really get into the more detailed aspects of his essay here. Okay, so he begins his discussion by asking us to think about a hypothetical scenario. Okay, and I believe maybe I mentioned it one other time when we talked about Galileo, the whole lost island thing. But in general, just understand that that's going to be a continuous, constant running throughout all studies in philosophy. The consideration of hypothetical scenarios, sometimes far-fetched, but just for the sake of clarifying a point within an argument. So follow me then as I ask you to think about this current hypothetical. Sometimes we also call these hypothetical scenarios thought experiments, where we ask you to just sort of think through a situation and then derive some intuitions from it. Okay, so here is the hypothetical to imagine. Imagine yourself walking around in the woods, okay? So you're just having a nice casual stroll in the woods. I don't know, maybe hiking, maybe just going out to be with nature for a bit. But while you're doing this, you would see all the kind of normal stuff that is in the woods. You'd see plants, rocks, little maybe woodland creatures running around, scampering around, rivers, streams, I don't know. But one thing you come across on your walk is unusual, and it's out of place. It's a big sphere. It's about your same height, and I mean, it's just a sphere sitting in the woods, and you can see through it. It's made out of, I don't know, glass or plastic, so it's translucent, like light can shine through it. but you come across that object. Okay, so here's like a little visual for you. This is you, and you're in that woods walking, and then you see this. It's my little artistic flair trying to show the curved surface with a light glinting off the side. Of course, it's a two-dimensional stick figure, but we don't have time to draw up things very detailed. Anyways, that's the example to imagine, okay? Put yourself in that situation. So here's a simple question to follow up from there. If that really happened, and you were just in a, like a wooded natural area, but you came across this strange-looking sphere, what do you think would be like a normal, basic reaction that you or just any random normal person would have if that happened? Like, what would be your kind of first thoughts that would be triggered by that? Well, you're saying touch it. That's an action. I'm asking you mentally what you would think, though. Why would you touch it? So, Sebastian, you're saying aliens. I'm not asking you to give me your hypothesis as to what caused it. I'm asking you for like the mental thought process that you had instantly. You say man-made, pick it up, okay. Again, though, Naaman, this is the same kind of thing I was saying earlier with Kobe. I'm not asking what you would do. I'm asking what you would think. What thoughts would occur to you? And Sergio, you're doing the same thing, Sebastian, trying to give me the origins. Why would we speculate as to its origins? I'm not talking about that. But I mean, okay, here we go. Someone put this weird thing here. What is that? What is this? What is that? Okay, good. Yeah, so like you'd have curiosity at a minimum. It would be like something weird. This is strange. I didn't expect to see this here. So it would trigger feelings of curiosity, inquiry. It would make you wonder, how did that get here? What's the reason that exists? And the reason you'd have this response is because it's unusual to find a thing like that in the woods. It would be a strange kind of person who's walking around the woods and they just see it and they don't even they're not even fazed. Like, oh, sphere, no problem, just walking, that's normal. So it's unusual, it's out of place, and that would lead you to think, like, why is it here? What's the explanation why it got here, okay? And yeah, okay, to be fair, some of you guys, you might start to speculate over the ultimate origin story. You might be like, what's the backstory? Did this thing come from aliens? Did it come from people? But look, guys, let's be honest. There's probably no aliens dropping off spheres in the woods. So you might think where did it come from, but we wouldn't necessarily have to assume aliens. I mean, it doesn't do anything. It's not like floating or whatever. It's not like got tentacles or like robot arms. It's just a big glass or plastic beach ball pretty much. But whatever. You'd wonder, how did it get there? Because it's not normal to see something like that in the woods. And that point he's making is this. You usually ask questions or become curious, how did that get there, when you see something out of place. But when things are in a place that you expected to find them, like a typical place to see something like that, then it doesn't trigger the same weird thoughts. Like, suppose you walked into an art gallery and you saw the sphere sitting in one of the rooms. You probably wouldn't go over and be like, how did this thing ever get here? What's the reason? How could a sphere be in an art gallery? You'd probably just be like, whatever, it looks like a piece of modern art, so I don't have any curiosity about it, because that's the kind of thing that you see in an art gallery. We used to teach classes in person, obviously, and when I would teach this lesson in the classroom, I would give this example because we were all in one place. I would say, see these desks? When you guys walked into this classroom, I'm sure none of you looked at the desk and you were like, whoa, where did that desk come from? What's the backstory on the desk? Did that desk, like, how did it emerge and arrive at this place in this classroom? So when we're used to the place where something is, we don't usually have these curious thoughts. When something unusual is spotted and it's somewhere, then we do have those kind of curious origin questions. Now, the next thing he says is this. Even though we don't have that natural response of curiosity towards everyday things in their normal place, isn't it possible to sort of stimulate that kind of question, though, even for the everyday things? Like here at this table that I'm, lecturing with, that my materials are sitting on. It's normal to see a table like this, I guess, in this kind of setting and scene. But couldn't I, if I really wanted to, look at the table and be like, where did it come from? What is its ultimate origin, right? If I'm a very curious person and if I like to kind of ponder things, couldn't I ask that about anything? You see like a random tree sitting somewhere on the street and you're like, I wonder how this tree, what its ultimate like life story is and what it started with, what planted it, blah, blah, blah. Like, did it get deposited as a seed by like some kind of animal that someone planted? So the point now is that even when it is an ordinary thing, not like the case of the sphere is just his test case to get our intuitions going in the beginning. But even if it's not a sphere, if it's like this table, the sweater that I'm wearing, or just anything at all, couldn't we ask the same question? Where is it from? What is its origin? About those things too. Do you feel me? Like we could ask those questions about anything. It would be most normal to do it when the thing is out of place. But even the in place, everyday average things that are not in a weird position or location, if we really wanted to, we could inquire as to their origins as well. Isn't that fair? Let me know if you agree. Right? Because this is a point that he wants to establish to get the argument started. So he gives us an odd example of finding a sphere in the woods. But then he switches gears and says, yeah, that would lead you to question where it came from. But even if it's not a normal question to ask every day, we could still be doing this when we see things in any place. You go to a car in a parking lot, and you're like, how did that car get built? Where did it come? What's the assembly process that led it to exist? True or not? Like all these questions you guys have about where did it come from and stuff, I'm just asking this. Couldn't you ask those same questions about normal stuff too? Jason, no. That's the wrong answer. Definitely yes. You could ask that question about anything. Jason, where did my sweater come from? You don't know. You could ask the question because you don't know. Okay, now even though you don't know where something originated from, whether it's from, like a normal place or an abnormal place, you know it had to have some origin. There's nobody who would ever say it comes from nothing. It came out of thin air. It just popped into reality out of like a vortex. Nobody would think that about the sphere, about my sweater, about this desk, or anything else. Everybody knows that things have an origin. Even when you're not presently aware of its origin, you know that it has to have one. Like this desk, okay, I bought it at Living Spaces a couple years back. And I don't really know exactly how it got to Living Spaces showroom and then to my apartment. I mean, I assume it's something like this. There are raw materials out there, like wood and stuff. They're collected by industrial processes. Then they're assembled into these different furniture items, shipped and distributed through transportation systems, and then sold at retail to people like me. But I don't know the precise like forest or whatever that the wood came from that built this table. Nonetheless, even though I'm not aware of those precise details about its backstory, I know it has to have one. I know it must have one because everything that exists has to have some kind of origin story that got it going. Even me and you, right? Here you are watching a lecture. Well, you had to have an origin, and we know that it was because of the conception of you by your parents, and we're very happy that they met. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here now. Same with me. So everything can be questioned as to its origin. He begins with the example of the sphere because he thinks it's weird and odd enough to get you to realize that that would be a curiosity for you. But then he says, although we're not in the habit of asking these origin questions about just all the stuff around us, we very much could, okay? So this is what leads us to this principle called the principle of sufficient reason. No, not to worry, Jason. I just wanted to clarify. When I see anything that I thought was misunderstanding, I have to kind of hit on it right then and there, and then you come forward with a good understanding from there. So it's all for the sake of learning. So next up, principle of sufficient reason. This example and the discussion that we just had is all designed to reveal this principle to us, the principle of sufficient reason. Principle of sufficient reason just says this, that in the case of anything that's true, there has to be a cause or an explanation for it. So in the case of any positive truth, you know what, I want to create more room. So you've seen the little cartoon. Let me write this up here so I have adequate space. Principle of sufficient reason. Okay, so in the case of any positive truth, and this is just verbatim from his statement in the book, in the case of any positive truth, there is some sufficient reason for it. In other words, to sort of say it more simply, there is a cause or an explanation for any fact. Okay, so if something's true, if something exists, something had to cause it to exist. It can't just exist by itself. It has to be brought to exist by some causal factors that precede it. What it's saying is that in any positive truth, there has to be this kind of sufficient reason, cause, or explanation. Let me mention what is a positive truth. Positive truth is just that something does exist. And given that something exists, there had to be a cause that caused it to exist. A negative truth would be that something does not exist. And those don't apply to the principle of sufficient reason. So like, for example, I have a cat. And since I have a cat, there has to be some origin that created this cat that caused it to exist. Right now in my apartment, there is no goat. Since there's no goat in my apartment, that's a negative truth. It's true that there is no goat on the premises, but the non-existence of the goat doesn't have to be explained. The existence of something must have an explanation or cause, but the non-existence of something doesn't function the same way. So if something does exist positively, like it affirmatively exists, then there had to be some kind of cause, explanation, or reason for it. That's all this is saying. And the sphere is one example that illustrates this, but then it generalizes across to just anything that exists, okay? So now, hopefully with that helpful discussion, his words will make a bit better sense. Let me read some of the words and you'll see what he said on this. So on page 25, he starts by writing, suppose you were strolling in the woods, and in addition to the sticks, stones, and other litter of the forest floor, you one day came upon some quite unaccustomed object, something not quite like what you had ever seen before and would never expect to find in such a place. Suppose, for example, that it is a large ball about your own height, perfectly smooth and translucent. You would deem this puzzling and mysterious, certainly. But if you consider the matter, it is no more inherently mysterious that such a thing should exist than that anything else should exist. If you were quite accustomed to finding such objects of this size around you most of the time, but had never seen an ordinary rock, then upon finding a large rock in the woods, you would be just as puzzled and mystified. And this illustrates the fact that something that is mysterious ceases to seem so simply by its accustomed presence, by being used to it. It is strange indeed, for example, that the universe exists, yet few people are very often struck by this strangeness and simply take it for granted. Okay, suppose then that you have found this translucent ball and are mystified by it. Whatever you might wonder about it, there is one thing you would not question. Namely, that it did not appear there all by itself, that it owes its existence to something. You might not have the remotest idea where and how it came to be there, but you would hardly doubt that there was some explanation. The idea that it came from nothing at all, that it could exist without any explanation or cause, is one that nobody would consider worthy of entertaining. And this illustrates a metaphysical belief that is a part of reason itself. Namely, that there is some explanation for the existence of anything whatsoever, some reason why it should exist rather than not. Okay, so he says the non-existence of something doesn't require a reason, like if I don't have a goat. But existence does. I do have a cat, so there has to be an ultimate explanation, even if I'm not currently aware of it, as to how she came to exist in this world. That there should never have been any ball in the forest doesn't require explanation, but that there is such a ball does. If you were to look upon a barren plain and ask why there is not and has never been a ball there, the response would be to ask why there should be. But if you find such a thing and wonder why it is there, it's not quite so natural to ask why it shouldn't be. Okay, so hopefully this brings into focus the main first point of his essay, to illustrate and persuade us of this principle called the principle of sufficient reason. I've tried to use his example. I've tried to give some other alternative examples. I just want you to understand it in a basic way. I mean, it's just saying that if something is a fact and something exists, there has to be some reason or cause behind it. Okay, that's true of me. That's true of you. That's true of, you know, the United States, the Eiffel Tower, the White House, the Hoover Dam, and the planet Earth, et cetera, et cetera. It seems like everything has to have a cause or an explanation for why it exists. So we started with the sphere, and then we were just kind of generalizing from that to broader examples. When was this theory made? At the beginning and the dawn of human history, like 5,000 years ago. I mean, it's ancient. There's no precise original author because you find it written about in all kinds of world religious traditions everywhere. But we are looking at a version of it stated in 1963 by the American philosopher Richard Taylor. But you'll see the same argument discussed by ancient people thousands of years ago in writings that we've recovered from ancient Greece and other parts of the world. So it's an ancient idea. But we're only part of the way through it, okay? So I'm just telling you guys about the principle of sufficient reason, which he tries to illustrate by means of the hypothetical and then the discussion that follows from that. Okay, so the next part of the argument we're going to discuss now. So he mentions after this that there are two different types of truths. Okay, two types of truth. Okay, so there are what are called contingent truths and contrasted with that, necessary truths. Okay, so first of all, contingent truths. So contingent truths are things that are true, okay, but they could have been false. They didn't have to be true. If things had played out differently, then they wouldn't have happened. So these are things that are true, but could have been false in different circumstances. Contingent truths. Things that are true, but they could have been false if the situation was a little different than it was. Okay, so we're going to talk now about contingent truths, and we're going to think of examples. I could spin off a bunch of random examples right now, but I would like to see you guys try to do it first. So can you tell me anything that is a fact? It's true. It's something that happened, but it might not have happened if things had just gone a little differently, or maybe a lot differently. I don't know, but something that could have conceivably occurred in a different way or not happened. So tell me some fact of the world that's true, but it wasn't guaranteed to happen. Okay, that you were named Leonard. There you go, that you were born. People are jumping right into that. A little bit, that's interesting, right? Yeah, you're here, and I'm glad that you do exist. But imagine that your parents never met, which I guess possibly could have happened. You know, your parents sometimes tell you that they didn't even know that they would end up together. Of course, they didn't know each other from their own birth. So the circumstances leading to your birth happened, but if things didn't just happen that way, then maybe you wouldn't have existed. Okay, that's one good thing. The death of the dinosaurs. Yeah, so I mean, the dinosaurs used to roam and walk around on the Earth, but something happened. We're not exactly sure. We think it's an asteroid. Nonetheless, if whatever caused their extinction didn't come to pass, maybe if the asteroid had taken a different path through space, then they wouldn't have become extinct, and maybe they would still be around, or maybe they would have evolved to become more intelligent or something. So yeah, that's contingent as well. The Astros win, yeah. Any kind of athletic outcome in the sporting match is going to be contingent as well. The Lakers are the NBA champions, but if I don't know, things had played out differently during the playoffs or whatever, or maybe if someone had taken a big injury, then that wouldn't have happened. So another thing, Titanic sinking, great. Joe Biden becoming president, yes, he's president. Had the votes gone differently, or maybe if a coup had succeeded or whatever, then he wouldn't have been. Yeah, so Kemper was a big mass murderer, sure. I have a cat named Peach, sure. I wouldn't have had her, I guess, if my old cat had lived longer, because the occasion for getting these cats was the passing of my previous cat of 16 years. So anyway, yeah, good. You guys are giving me all good and fair examples. These are all contingent truths. These are things that are true, but it's only due to circumstances, and the circumstances could have been different. Okay. Now, necessary truths. These are things that are true, but could not even possibly be false, not even in theory, not even in the mind. So things that are true that could not possibly be false. Necessary truths. Oh no, it's all right, Cameron. I was like trying to parse that. I was like, Lakers shaking my head. Lakers, but anyway, it's fine. So yeah, necessary truths, things that are true and could not even possibly be false. Now, examples of necessary truths are maybe a little bit trickier to come up with right off the top of your head, a little, because you really got to think about things that have no potential to be false, no matter what could possibly happen. So let's see. Well, Kobe, you say water is necessary for life. Sure enough, it is on the planet Earth, but I think, again, this is like that kind of outside the box thinking. It's not impossible to consider a situation where we could have evolved forms of life that don't subsist on H2O. I mean, there could have been like weird little microbial life forms that consumed other types of sustenance from the periodic table of elements, and had those evolved and reached their full evolution. Maybe then we would be life forms not relying on water, but some other kind of compound. Gravity pulls things, yes. When you talk about physical laws like gravity and inertia, entropy, it seems like those things can't possibly be false. But I've heard it said by some cosmologists that if the initial inflation rate of the outward ejection of matter from the Big Bang had been even slightly different, then some of the physical forces of nature would have been actually quite different too. Brandy, you say you were born. Come on, but you might not have been born. I mean, your birth is not necessary. Your birth is a contingent event because you weren't something that existed for the entire history of the universe. So there's a time when you weren't alive. There's a time later when you won't be alive. So your birth is conditioned on events having happened a certain way. I mean, your mom and dad, what if they never met? So that's not necessary. Matter exists? Well, no, sorry, Angel, because the whole existence of the universe, this is something that I need to save for a moment, but that's something that we can also see as contingent. Shakespeare wrote a lot of plays. Well, Shakespeare didn't even need to be born. So that's certainly not at all a necessary truth. So I like Leo, your example. Leo, I think you know something about logic. So necessary truth is like formal stuff. 2 + 2 = 4. 2 + 2 = 4 is not something that's true sometimes and not other times. It's not like the weather forecast where you're like, maybe there will be rain, but maybe there won't be. 2 + 2 = 4 is just a necessary truth given by the nature of those numerals and the mathematical operation of addition. So it's not like that's a matter of chance or probability, unlike anything that's contingent, which had some at least possible chance of not happening. Jason, you say all bluebirds are colored. Okay, good. One other category of necessary truth is to assert a self-identity. Anything of the form A = A. So if I say the dog is a dog, that's a necessary truth. And if I repeat a predicate stated in referring to the subject, that would be necessary truth as well. Like if I say that the bluebird is blue, that would be a necessary truth. Okay, so stuff like 2 + 2 = 4, geometric truths can also fit this category, like there are 3 sides to a triangle, trigonometric truths, logical axioms. Nothing about space and time, though, and the physical world, because everything about the physical world, well, let's get to that now. Having spoken about the 2 kinds of truths, let me just summarize one last time. Contingent truths, things that are true, but they could have not been true. Take Tom Brady being in the Super Bowl again. I mean, he is, but you know, he might have lost in the playoffs or taken an injury or something earlier in the season, and so it happened, but it might not have if things played out differently. Necessary truths is like 2 + 2 = 4, the square root of 9 is 3, the number of every point on the perimeter of a circle is equally distant from the radius. Sergio, is color a necessary truth? No, I didn't say that. Color, well, mentioning of a subject that it is the same subject is a special case. Like if I say the tall man is tall, that's just saying that he has the feature which was already mentioned in the statement of who he is. But color itself and the existence of color, you could argue, is something that's conditioned on the way our visual system perceives incoming waves of light. Some argue that color is not really found in objective reality, but it's a subjective experience which comes from the processing of light rays by your visual system and brain. But if you really get deep into the science of color, the color effect is produced by the specific nanometer wavelength of light that enters your retina. And so the kind of wavelength of light that is refracted from a given object can be specified in a way that's objective. But this is just kind of a little talk of science that takes us afield from here. Anyways, guys, just to repeat, contingent and necessary truths. These things have to be true, and there's no possibility that they aren't. They're kind of technical, formal truths, mathematical, logical, geometric, etc. And then these are things that are just matters of circumstance. Even if they're very probable, then they might not have happened. Okay, so now let's go on. As we continue to develop the argument, the next point that is mentioned is this. Here's one thing that's true that is indisputable to everybody, and that is that the universe exists. The universe exists. It's not possible to doubt that the universe exists, because here you are and you're a part of it. So if you didn't think the universe existed, I don't know how you would be able to comprehend what's even happening right now. I mean, if there's no universe, then there's no space and time, and then there's no way that you could possibly exist in the universe. So there's a universe, we're a small part of it, but it's there, and it definitively exists. So here's a question. This is a truth, but which kind of truth? Contingent or necessary? What do you think is the judgment of the author, and I guess the consensus view of most who think about it? That the universe, which exists, that we are a part of, is either what? Contingent or necessary? Which one? Okay, Leo, you say contingent. Yes. Any thoughts about why? Well, I'll try and explain it. The universe that we're a part of exists. Some might think it's necessary, Angel. I understand why you suggest that, and Jocelyn the same, because you're like, well, everything in the universe kind of comes and goes, but the whole thing itself, that can't possibly not exist. But what the author argues in the paper, and what many others have argued too, is that it is contingent. The universe and all things within it are contingent. Why? Because every part of the universe is contingent. Think about us. We didn't need to have existed, nor did this planet, nor did this solar system. Like, everything that comes to exist starts at a given time and then perishes at a later time. And it seems like that's true not just of individual life forms on the planet Earth, but the whole planet, the whole solar system. I mean, eventually the sun, exhausts its fuel in supernovas. So those things are not permanent. They're all temporary, and that means that they all have to be brought into existence by something, and later on they cease to exist. So if that's what's the case with all the planets, stars, and as you go out and out and out, it looks like everything is contingent. So if all parts of the universe are contingent, then wouldn't the whole thing be as well? That's what he thinks is reasonable to conclude. Just as much as you might not have been born, or the earth might not have formed, maybe the universe itself might not have existed if that contingent set of events that led to its existence didn't happen. So as he's arguing anyway, the existence of the whole universe is true, but it's contingently true. Now, the principle of sufficient reason says that when there are contingent truths, they have to have what? Now we come back to the principle of sufficient reason and connect it to the present point. So the principle of sufficient reason says that for everything that's true, and in particular for the things that are contingent, they have to have what? Remind me of that point. Contingent truths, according to the principle of sufficient reason, must have, you say, an origin, right, Sergio? But the way of putting it, we could say also it just has to have a cause. It has to have an explanation, a reason for existing. Okay? So now we have a big question. What's the cause? What could be the cause of the universe? Okay, so let me walk you through all the steps that got us to this point. He begins with the example of a sphere. And the sphere example is just to sort of tease out this idea that when there's something that exists, there had to be a cause for it. We know that, and we feel that when the thing is something weird and unusual, because that leads us to sort of scratch our head and be like, what caused that? But even the things that are not unusual, like just me and you and furniture around us or anything else, it's also got to have an origin. So anything that's true, that's a positive truth, has to have a cause. That's the principle of sufficient reason. Okay, then he mentions these two different types of truths, contingent and necessary. Contingent truths, things that are true but might not have happened, like the Lakers winning title last year or anything else. And necessary truths, things that are true but couldn't be false, like 2 + 2 is 4. Okay, the principle of sufficient reason says that these contingent truths at least have to have a cause or an explanation. And then it is pointed out that the universe exists and that this is a contingent truth. So we must now ask one big question that leads to his conclusion in the end. What's the cause, or what could be the cause, which explains the universe existing? Okay, so suppose that this here circle is just a diagram. I'll put the letter U, and it stands for universe. So this is the whole universe, let's imagine. Everything is inside of there. Me, you, the planet Earth, and everything else. It's all in there, all of space and time. Okay, now, question. Do you think that something that's a part of the universe could cause the universe to exist? Could the universe cause its own existence? Think about that question and give me what you think is your best answer. Could the universe cause itself? Could a part of the universe bring the universe into existence? If you think about it, you should be able to give a pretty, I think, straightforward answer on that. Could the universe cause itself to exist? Could it be the cause? Okay, Leo? No. Jerry, also no. Good. Let me ask you guys that are saying no, which would appear to be the reasonable answer, yes. Why is it that it can't cause itself? Okay, good, Leo. Well, maybe you want to say it a little more fulsome way so I can make sure I am getting your point clearly. But why would it be impossible for the universe to cause itself, or for anything to cause itself, really? Why is that just illogical and contradictory to say something caused itself to exist? Yeah, so Leo, because it does not exist yet, think about what Leo's saying, Sebastian. If something causes something else, then it cannot be that it already exists, you see. It's like this. Can a person give birth to themselves? I hope you find that to be an absurd suggestion. Because in order for something to cause another thing, it has to already exist to be the cause. So the universe is the effect of some cause. If it's the effect, it's the thing that's produced by whatever caused it. So it cannot both be the cause and the effect. If it were able to cause itself to exist, then it would have already existed in order to be the causing factor. So understand that just doesn't make sense. So he says this is a not viable suggestion. That something in the universe is somehow the cause of it? Nope. That just doesn't make sense because it would have to already have existed in order to function as the cause. But we're asking what is the cause of this thing called the universe. Okay, so very good discussion, and I like the comments that you guys have said here. So it seems then that something outside the universe, something that's different from the universe, not something part of it, but something that's separate entirely and independent from it, has to be the cause of that universe. Okay, so let's try another suggestion. Here, let's say is the universe, and this is like an arrow of causation. This is the effect, and this is the cause over here. Let me label this as C. And I'm labeling it with C to say it's contingent. And I have a question. Could something contingent have been the cause of the universe? What do you think about that? Could something that is a contingent truth or being, could a contingent thing be the cause of the universe? Would that be a better suggestion? It's not part of the universe. It's something separate from it, but it's contingent. Do you think this would be a better possible option? Okay, some of you are saying yes, but let's pause for a moment and think about this. If a contingent thing causes the universe, though, there's actually a problem. Maybe some of you can think and give me the answer. Good, Janice. The problem is that if it's contingent, well, then according to the principle of sufficient reason, it didn't need to exist. And therefore, it must have a cause. You understand? If the cause of the universe is something that depends on something else, which is what contingent things depend on, then this couldn't be the ultimate explanation of everything. We would have to ask a new question, which is this: what's the cause of the universe? And that would just push us back to another contingent being. And if this being is contingent as well, then we have this kind of infinite regress of contingent causes going back and back and back with no origin. So he says ultimately it can't be that a contingent thing causes the universe, because if it's something contingent, it isn't the first thing. A contingent thing can't exist out of nowhere, just like the sphere that we talked about before. And so he says this doesn't work either. Saying that the universe is caused by a contingent thing leads to what is called an infinite regress. Yes, Kobe. And an infinite regress is just a terminology which refers to a sequence of causes that goes back forever without ever any origin. But an infinite regress is thought to be absurd and impossible. So he makes this claim. Infinite regress is not possible, is impossible. Okay, so it's not possible for this regress of causes to just go back to infinity, because that wouldn't really give any explanation at the end of the day as to why the whole series exists in the first place. You know, if we just have causes on causes on causes to infinity, then we're still left wondering what grounds the whole series, what causes the entire sequence to exist, and it's no real answer. It's just sort of like kicking the can back to another level of explanation, but never really reaching the origin. Okay, so he says this is also not going to work. To suppose that the universe is caused by something contingent really doesn't take us to the origins, because if it's a contingent cause, then in turn, it has to have a cause as well. So ultimately, he says there's only one possible picture that does make sense. Okay, let me move on from this in just 1 second. I want to make a reference. Maybe it's something that you can remember. Sometimes I've watched this cartoon show, Rick and Morty. I don't know if any of you guys have ever watched that, but it's kind of funny, and oftentimes there's some philosophical, reflection that goes on in some of these scripts. Anyway, there's like one episode. You don't have to be a fan of the show to know about what I'm describing, but like in one episode, Rick, who's like this crazy scientist guy, he creates a universe or something, and relative to that universe that he creates, like he's the creator, so they all kind of look at him as like the creator god, right? But then it seems like in the universe that he's the creator of the other one, he's also been created by another Rick in like another version of the universe, right? So it looks like we just have like Ricks and Ricks and Ricks and all these different universes creating the next one down in the sequence. What the author Taylor is saying is that ultimately doesn't get us to any ultimate origins or explanations. It's just saying there's an infinite sequence of causation, but it doesn't place anything at the beginning. So he says that's not possible because an infinite regress is absurd. So there's only one way then he thinks that the universe could have been caused to exist. So say we have the universe, it's got to have a cause, but instead of it being contingent, he says the being or the cause of the universe has to be what kind of thing? Not contingent, but what's the other? Yeah, question. It's not going to be a contingent being because that would just set us on an infinite regress. So there has to be a cause that's separate from the universe, yes, but it has to be good, Kobe, something that's a necessary being. And if that is the case, then that's God. Okay, a necessary being is a being that doesn't depend on anything else, that is independent. Everything follows from it, but it doesn't depend on anything else behind it. So he says, if we didn't have a necessary being where the sort of causal story stops, where the buck stops, as it were, then we would just have a regress of contingent causes that goes back forever. So ultimately, something has to be the first cause, the thing that initiates everything else, but which doesn't itself have any prior causes standing behind it. And that would have to be a necessary being, something that is not depending on anything else, but everything depends on it. And that being would be God. God being necessary isn't contingent, so he doesn't have dependence on prior causes. He just exists through his own nature necessarily. And he is the cause and the source of the contingent universe and all the contingent things inside of it. So Kobe, you say, so there can still be a chain of contingent causes, but the very, very beginning has to be necessary. Okay, very, very wise question. Yes, that's a possibility. Suppose that our universe is the creation of super intelligent scientists in another dimension, and we're living in a simulation. You've heard people probably suggest this, that we are simulated characters living in someone else's version of reality they've made. But if that's the case, then the people who are the programmers are in a universe, which itself has to, let's say, be caused by something. But it could be that there's like several layers of this, but ultimately it has to originate an issue from God. Otherwise, it would just be an infinitely regressive series, and it wouldn't make any sense as to why the whole sequence exists if it never has a beginning point. So yeah, there could be some number of intermediate contingent causes, but ultimately would have to run aground with something that doesn't depend on anything else. Because again, if it was contingent, then it would still not be the first thing. Are we going to read counter arguments? Oh yeah, Sergio, definitely. There's a lot of counter arguments to the cosmological argument too. I find that it's, in my mind, a little more persuasive and compelling, because where do you enter into an objection? It's like, it just says there's cause and effect, and that things which exist have causes. And if you apply that same reasoning to the whole universe, you do get into this tricky realm where it's like hard to see how it could have been caused by something that is contingent. But there are very good counter arguments, yes, and we're going to study those next meeting pretty much. I could give you like a little preview of them just in passing right now. But some people say, well, if everything has to have a cause, then doesn't God have to have a cause? Some say it makes no sense to just stipulate that he can have no cause, because the whole argument takes its inspiration from saying that things have to have a cause. That's the principle of sufficient reason. So some people find that to be contradictory. Everything has a cause, oops, but not God. Other times people say, well, if God does not have to have a cause, then why couldn't we just make it assume that the universe has no cause and it's the necessary being by itself? If that was true, then we wouldn't have to suppose that it's supported by anything else except for itself. If God could be a necessary being, why couldn't the universe just be that? And then we don't have to assume that there's anything that's related to the universe which is outside of it. That's another possible objection. Some people say an infinite regress is not impossible, right? So some people challenge the argument by saying, I didn't follow your step where you said we couldn't have an infinite regress. Why not? Why couldn't there just be like an infinite series of Ricks or whatever, an infinite series of contingent causes that just never really does reach to an origin? So there's many different ways to resist the force of the argument, but those are some of the main ones, and we'll talk in better depth about it next time. So here I'll read a little bit from the author about it, and yeah, Sergio, I could see you're kind of thinking the same thing as that objection. Here's what he wrote. He says, it happens to be true that something exists, that there is a universe, and although no one ever seriously supposes that there might not be, there still seems to be nothing necessary in the existence of the universe, considering it just by itself. That no universe should ever exist is perfectly comprehensible and does not seem to express any absurdity. Considering any particular item in the world, it seems not at all necessary that the totality of these things or the totality of everything should ever exist. From the principle of sufficient reason, it follows that there must be a reason not only for the existence of anything in the universe, but for the universe itself. Everything that ever exists except for God must have an explanation. This principle does not imply that there must be a purpose or goal for everything. All the principle requires is that there be some sort of reason or cause for everything. And it would be odd to say that everything in the universe owes its existence to something else, that nothing in the world is either just bestows its own being upon itself, but deny this of the universe itself. And then he says, if, as the principle of sufficient reason implies, there must be a reason for the existence of the universe, then that reason must be found either in the universe or outside of it, in something that is literally internal to it or outside of it. Now, if we suppose that the universe, everything that exists except for God, contains within itself the reason for its existence, then we would say that it is a necessary being causing itself. In that case, there would be no reason to suppose God's existence, but it's implausible because we see nothing about the universe or anything within it to suggest that it exists by its own nature. On the contrary, we find many reasons to suggest that it doesn't. Everything that exists by its very nature would have to be indestructible and eternal. But nothing about the universe seems like that. Everything comes into being and passes away. Some of the things last a long time and are very old, the moon, the stars, the planets, but it's possible to imagine them no longer existing, and they do have a finite span of time, even if it is much longer. There seems to be nothing in the world, then, concerning which it is plausible to say that it exists through its own nature. Everything in the universe appears to be quite the opposite, namely something that not only didn't need to exist, but at some time or another in the past, future, or both, doesn't in fact exist. Everything in the universe seems to have a finite duration. Most things, like ourselves, exist only a short while. Other things, like planets, etc., last longer, but they still perish. We arrive at the conclusion, then, that although the universe may contain some things that have been there for a long time, it's doubtful that they can be there forever and that they are eternal and not contingent. So, it would seem, then, that the universe is contingent and therefore dependent upon something other than itself for its existence, if it depends on anything at all. And it must depend on something, because otherwise there would be no reason why it exists in the first place. That upon which the universe depends must be something that either exists through its own nature or doesn't. If it doesn't exist by its own nature, if it's contingent, then that in turn would depend for its existence on something else, and on and on and on to infinity. So the world could either depend upon something that depends upon something else to infinity, or it could depend on something that exists through its own nature and is therefore eternal, necessary, and imperishable, and that is the creator of heaven and earth. He says the first alternative is impossible because an infinite regress doesn't give a good reason why everything exists in the first place. Instead of giving the reason, it simply begs off giving the reason by saying, consider another contingent being in the sequence of causes. So that's what he ultimately says. He says the universe has to have a cause. The cause cannot be something contingent, but if the universe is caused by something that isn't contingent, then it's caused by something that's necessary, eternal, indestructible, and that has no possibility of not existing or being false. And that would be, he thinks, the concept or idea of God. So yeah, it's basically an argument which traces the conclusion that God exists, a few other points, that the universe evidently exists, and that everything in the universe is contingent and therefore needs a cause to explain why it exists. If that's true of each particular thing, then he thinks it's true of the entire system of the universe as well, because as go all the parts, so goes the whole, as he would think. So if there's a cause for the universe, there's only a short range of options as to what it could be. It can't be causing itself, that's contradictory. He thinks it can't be caused by something contingent because that would set us on an infinite regress, which he regards as absurd. So the only remaining alternative is that there's some necessary being that does not depend on anything, and from which the universe and all things issue. Now, there's other arguments for the existence of God, and we have to talk about them next time, I guess. I'm saving some time at the beginning of next meeting to go over the design argument. This is another third major argument for God's existence. And then from there, we'll start to learn more objections to these different views, the cosmological and design argument. One more thing I wanted to say about the cosmological argument here. At one point in the essay, he talked about the possibility that the universe has always been here, that it's got no beginning, that it's eternal. Some people think that if the universe is eternal, that means that it couldn't have had a creator, because if it has been here forever, then there wouldn't have been any time before it existed. At that point, the creator could have generated it and brought it into being. So it makes a lot more sense to say the universe has a creator if you presume that it hasn't always existed. And the consensus view, both of science and of theism, is that it hasn't always been here. Either the Big Bang or creationism both hold that the universe has an origin in time. But suppose that you believe it has no beginning, that it's beginningless. It's literally just always been there, and there's never been a start. He says even if that's true, he would still say that it has to be dependent on God. So he gives ability. He says if the universe is eternal in time, then God and the universe are co-eternal. They're both eternal. But throughout that entire time period, the universe has been depending on God for its existence, not the other way around. And so it is still, in that sense, his creation that depends on him. Now, that's a little bit of a weird idea, to say that something is the creation that depends on something else, but they're both eternal. He gives us a metaphor to try and think of this point. So here's the metaphor. It's a metaphor of a flame and light. Imagine this drawing is of a flame. And once the flame is lit, there's light that's coming off the flame, you know? It illuminates with light. So here's a question. When the flame gets lit up, does the light appear at the same time as the flame? Yes or no? Is it that we spark a match and it's instantly giving off light automatically, as not like in a time delay? It's not like the flame is lit up and then we have to wait a few moments and then we get the light. Don't they happen at once? I know I'm asking it as a question, but it's just an evident fact, yes. It's not like one of those fluorescent lights. You flip the switch and you wait a while before the tube fills with gas and shows the light. No, a flame is coextensive in time with the light that it gives. Okay? So now, another question. What does the light cause the flame, or does the flame cause the light? Well, that's also, I hope, clear enough. It is the flame that issues and gives off the light. It's not like light beams cause the flame, but the flame, on the other hand, does cause these light beams. So now imagine this. Imagine that this flame has been burning forever. It's a little blurry. Well, there's not much here. It's just a picture of a flame and some light little rays that are just drawn off of it. Imagine that the flame has been burning forever. If it's been burning forever, then throughout that entire span of eternity, the flame has been the cause and the light has been the effect. Even though they are co-temporal, one does not precede the other in time. Okay, so now, by metaphor, think of God as being like the flame and the universe being like the light. So if God has always existed, then it could be that it's like the light he gives off is the universe and the creation. And they've both been there forever. But throughout that entire time span, it has been the creation depends on God for its existence, not the other way around. Now, he's not insisting that the universe has been there forever, but he knows some people think that it has. And what he's trying to say here is that either way you go, whether it's been there only for a limited time or forever, it would still have to have some kind of God that it depends on, some necessary being, because it's contingent, and therefore, even if it's been there forever, on the model of this flame and light, it's just been depending on God forever, like the light given off by this flame. Back when I was a student at UCLA, learning the same topics, I had a great professor, Calvin Normar, and he was teaching this lesson, and he used a slightly different example. He said, imagine that you've got a big giant standing on the sand in the beach. So he's leaving a footprint with his foot. Now ask this question. What's the cause and what's the effect between the giant and the footprint? Is he the cause and the footprint is the effect, or is it the other way around? Well, clearly, he is the cause of the footprint. Without him, the footprint wouldn't exist. But he would exist even if the footprint did not. Okay, so it's not like the footprint causes the giant. It's the other direction. Now imagine that this giant's been standing in the sand forever, for all eternity. Then in that case, for all eternity, the footprint and the giant have existed. But nonetheless, it has been depending on him and not the other way around. So again, this metaphor would be taken as the universe is parallel to the footprint. God is parallel to the giant. And so even if he's always been there, and the universe has as well, it's been depending on him throughout that time span. So I know that's a little bit of a weird idea. In my mind, it makes a lot more sense to say the universe has a creator if it hasn't always been there. But what he's saying is that even if you insist on an infinite, eternal universe, and that's your intuition, there's still room to say it had to be created by God along the lines advanced by these metaphors. So I'm going to just close with one more little quote from the book here on that point, and then we're good for today. He says, people tend to think that creation means creation in time, from which it of course follows that if the world had no beginning in time, then it couldn't be the creation of God. But that's an error, because creation means, even in Christian theology, dependence. If one thing is the creation of another, then it depends for its existence on the other. And this is perfectly consistent with saying that both are eternal, and that neither ever came into being, and hence that neither was ever created at any point in time. Perhaps an analogy will convey the point. Consider a flame that is casting off beams of light. Now there seems to be a clear sense in which the beams of light depend for their existence on the flame, which is their source. But the flame, on the other hand, does not depend for its existence on the light. The beams of light arise from the flame, but the flame does not arise from the light beams. In this sense, they are the creation of the flame, and they derive their existence from it. But none of this has reference to time. The relationship of dependence in such a case would not be altered if we say the flame has always been burning, and that neither the flame nor the beams had ever come into being. So if the universe is the creation of God, its relationship to God should be thought of like this, namely that the universe depends for its existence upon God and could not exist without him. If God is eternal, as many of course assume, then the universe may but need not be eternal too, without altering its dependence on God for its existence. The supposition that God is eternal, on the other hand, doesn't imply that the universe is eternal, but if it is, then it would still depend on God in the manner expressed here by the metaphor. So that's really it for today's lesson. I guess what we've done is we reviewed and recapped our meetings on the ontological argument and some of those objections, and now we've added to our growing list of cosmological argument. It's an argument based on cause and effect and the universe could have originated. In my view, if I was choosing between the ontological and the cosmological argument, I find this one to be a little bit more compelling, but there are certain objections that can be raised against it also. So we'll get into those next week. And I guess that's it for today's meeting. We've come to the full time. So thanks again, everybody, for your attendance and all your good comments and participation. I really appreciate it. Have a good weekend, and we'll just be in touch next week when we get back on Tuesday. Until then, if you need anything by email or anything else, let me know. But yeah, have a good one and take it easy, and I'll see you then. All right, bye-bye, guys.